Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing special guest Carol J. Michael. Based in Indiana, Carol is a blogger and podcaster and award-winning author of a number of gardening books and a children's book. You can't follow Carol on Twitter for reasons we'll get into, but you can check out her website at Carol J. Michael, that's MICHEL.com, her blog at maydreamsgardens.com, her YouTube channel at youtube.com/indiegardener, and the Garden Angelus podcasts, which she co-hosts with Dee Nash. In this interview, we're going to talk about Carol's background and her books, maybe a bit about gardening, and then we're going to focus on her recent popular post on Jane Friedman's website about how to market your book without social media. So thank you very much, Carol, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe where you came from and grew up and how you made your way into gardening.
So I grew up here in Indiana, where I still live, and I started gardening like many lucky children, following my dad around in the garden, and I loved it. I also loved writing, and I remember writing stories in the second grade and thinking that was, the teacher thought it was a punishment if you had to stay in for recess and make you write a story, and I thought, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. So I did go to Purdue University, and I got a degree in horticulture. And I got out of Purdue University and realized that the economy at that time, which was decades ago, was not good. And prospects for jobs were not good. So I went right back and got a computer technology associate degree. And then, as I tell people, I got the first job I was offered working as a COBOL programmer in healthcare IT. And I stayed there for 33 years until I took an early retirement. And I became like the director of something or others. And anyway, about, I'm going to say 10 years before I retired, I was talking to these tech guys. And by then I'm in management, so I don't really have all the details of every technology. I says, what are these weblogs? It seems like it's easy to get on the web with these weblogs. And they explained it to me. And so I made a couple of fits and starts. And in 2006, I really started blogging about gardening. I was still working full time. I loved doing it. And I not immediately, but I started to have an audience. And I did something that turns out today, and we're into 15 years of doing this, something called Garden Bloggers Bloom Day. On the 15th of every month, I got gardeners across the country, around the world, to post what's blooming in your garden, and then come back and link to my blog. And in the early days, we get like 100. And now, during the height of the growing season, I might get 40 or 50. During the winter, it might be 20 or 30, but I never give it up because, hey, people, they post, they link, and that is all good in the blogging world.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. It's so interesting. I was quite fascinated when I saw that you had this background in computer technology and things like that. Partly because that's just as we were talking about before the podcast, most Lean Pub authors are people who are sort of from or adjacent to that space. What was your training like? It's changed. And one thing I like to ask people about is things have changed so much. So back in those days, there was no, Stack Overflow or kind of like things you could go to on the web to learn. Did you have just stacks of books and, write out code by hand and things like that?
Well, yes. Now, when I actually got into computer technology, we were no longer using punch cards. So those were out. When I started work, where I worked, they still had some things that they did with punch card. But I tell people, I said, it's this ancient language known as COBOL. And if I'd stayed as a COBOL programmer, I could be making a lot of money right now because COBOL programmers are aging out. But some of that software is still out there running, especially with big banks, credit card companies. There's some people that are running some serious COBOL. But yeah, we learned in school, and then you basically had manuals and books. And that's what you learned from. And if you had a question, you had to go to the manual and look it up, or, holler across the cubicle wall, because we did have cubicles, and say, hey, do you know how to do such and such? So it was interesting. And I was actually pretty good at it. So when you're pretty good at it, you get on into management, because then you realize you don't want to do that all your life. And so I never learned the PC languages at all. So I didn't get into C++ or any of that. I managed people who did that, and I assumed that they knew what they were doing.
And it must have been, healthcare must have been just a fascinating industry to have been in for the last 30 years. Just amazing transformations.
Yeah, amazing transformations. From the very beginnings, it was was business applications, payroll and getting the charge in and billing out to the patient. And then gradually over the 33 plus years, and I've been out of it for 5 years, so I don't even have a clue. I mean, then to make that electronic chart so that the doctor can look up the information. And, used to be, and you're probably too young for this, but if you went to the doctor, they'd ask you like a series of questions. And then if they gave you to a specialist, they would ask you the same series of questions. And so you kept repeating information, and the electronic record really helps to share that information around.
Yeah, I'm a little older than I look. And I do remember those days, walking into, the doctor's office, and it's, there would always be this wall of files, of paper files and manila folders with color coding on them and things like that. And yeah, the repetition of things, the miscommunication about things was a common experience. It was so fascinating. I mean, like so many other people, I got vaccinated twice now because of the pandemic, and the experience was just incredible compared to what would have been possible in the olden days, right? Like, here I got an email saying, do you want an appointment? Click here. I got to pick the time down to the 5-minute increment. It told me where to go. It even gave me a QR code. And I went there and stood in line, and like all I did was like swipe my driver's license. And then I stood in line, and it all just happened magically. They knew who I was every step of the way, and whether I'd had my first one or my second one and things like that. It was just incredible. And to think about the amazing things that, about like tracking prescriptions and things like that
Sure.
have become possible.
And that is the upside of it. The downside of it is that the doctor feels like he's got too much time staring at a screen and not enough time staring at you, the patient. And so, that's the doctor's complaint, is they have to put so much into the chart. But and speaking of paper records versus electronic records, so this kind of comes back to that. I had this blog, and I had today it's got almost 2,600 posts on it. I mean, it's a ginormous blog. And I remember I used to read a magazine called Computer World, and they had an article in there that said the Smithsonian, if they wanted to preserve something, they would far rather preserve something in paper than electronic format. Because if it's electronic, and somebody hands them a 3.5-inch floppy and says, preserve this, I have to preserve that floppy and the equipment to read that and that file type in perpetuity. And that's not going to be, in 50 years, who knows? So I always felt like what was on my blog, I wanted to get it off my blog and into a book in paper form, so that someday somebody would walk, not that it's going to end up at the Smithsonian, but somebody might walk into a used bookstore and there would be this dusty old book called Potted and Pruned, and they would discover it, and it would be kind of fun for them. I thought it would be fun for me.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. That topic of preserving information, and particularly libraries and books and stuff like that, is something I could talk about for forever. It sounds like you could too. I remember, I think it was in the mid to late 90s when some libraries started investing a lot in those giant laser discs to preserve information, and then that didn't last.
Nope.
And people who are concerned about archiving the web and things like that, this is just a huge issue. But it's also there with books. And the idea that you would publish a blog as a book motivated by the idea to preserve it makes complete sense if you think about that kind of thing. And so you started publishing books based on your blog, and your latest one is Digging and Delighted. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about. And by the way, for anyone listening, there's going to be links in our transcript online to everything here. But yeah, your latest book came out just recently, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So there's actually 5 books, and it started out one book, and then there were 2, and then I thought, a trilogy sounds nice. And then I did a 4th, and I tried to make it not part of the other 3. That made no sense. And so now I looked it up. Basically it's a series, and it can go on indefinitely. And because of the way I title them with alliteration and, Potted and Pruned, and now Digging and Delighted, and I have other letters of the alphabet, they accuse me of being the one who's going to try to use every letter of the alphabet, and I won't stop and they're trying to figure out, well, what's X in the garden? So, but anyway, Digging and Delighted is probably, it's loosely based on the kind of stuff I used to blog about, but it is sort of my advice to live your best gardening life. And so it's like one of my friends said when they were reading it, they said, Carol, you're trying to help us learn to think like a gardener. And it's like, that's it. I'm trying to help you think about the way gardeners think about things. And it's a little bit different, especially if you're new to gardening. You're like, people like me that have been gardening my whole life. I mean, I'm slinging plants around and, they're like, do you have to be more careful with those? And the famous question that I got at the checkouts of a discount store that starts with W was, do these seeds work? And I'm like, did you go to school? do you know where food comes from? If seeds don't work, we're an extinct species at this point. So I just have a lot of there's 30 chapters like that. Just advice to think like a gardener.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you about that. Actually, by the way, I definitely recommend listening to the Garden Angelus podcast. It's absolutely delightful.
Well, thank you.
And kind of just fun and relaxing and very informative at the same time. And when you talk about thinking like a gardener, you reminded me of a couple of. I never got into it, but my dad's a biologist, and he loved poking around in the little garden that we had. And I remember, this is a little bit of a gruesome thing for anyone listening, but I grew up in Saskatchewan in Canada, and there were lots of grasshoppers. And my dad, to sort of make me and my brother laugh, he thought it would anyway, he was popping the heads off grasshoppers and then showing us how they keep jumping around. I don't remember finding it funny. And but another time he was eating some broccoli from the garden, and I pointed out that there were these gray worms all over it, and he goes, oh yeah, protein, and just pops a new one in.
Right.
But when you talk about thinking like a gardener, I was wondering if you could maybe give a couple of specific examples. I mean, is it patience, for example, things like that?
Well, it's things that people don't think about. Like if you move into an existing garden, people just tend to sort of put up with the plants that are there. And I say, grow the plants you love. And if there's a bunch of plants in your garden that you don't love, what's the joy of going out there and working in the garden? Because let's face it, it's hard work. So I advocate, if you don't love that plant, get rid of it. Get another plant that you do love. And then the other thing, people in gardening, they get kind of nervous because we have botanical names for plants. So, and it's very useful because the botanical name of I can't even think of a botanical name right now, but coneflowers is a very common Native American flower. And the name of it escapes me. Give me 1 minute. Echinacea purpurea. So I can ask for Echinacea purpurea anywhere in the world, and it is the exact same plant, or it should be. And the thing is, people are afraid to pronounce those words because they look weird. And, am I saying Echinacea correctly, or is it Echinacea? And what I tell people is that botanical Latin is a written language, not a spoken language. And don't let anybody tell you that you've pronounced it wrong, because nobody knows how they're pronounced. You just pronounce it. It's clematis, which is a nice vine. And either way is correct, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I would say one of the things that I find intimidating when I even just think about gardening is like trying to get it right? That there's going to be some rules that I've got to learn, that there's going to be some conventions that I have to follow. And just natural, I don't know why, but naturally for me, I mean, I guess it's fear of the plant dying is probably the main thing that I find kind of puts me in that kind of passive, I mean, I don't do it, but passive relationship when I think about it. Oh, I've really got a responsibility to try and make this work, but that's not up to me. That's up to some rules out there that I've got to find and follow.
There really aren't as many rules as people think. And if you're a gardener, you have killed more plants than you will ever admit. I mean, I got a whole graveyard. It's called the compost pile. But there's tons of plants that I've killed. I've killed house plants. I've intentionally killed plants. It's like this sucker's got to go. Of course, weeds have got to go. And there's some things that I thought, oh, I want to keep that going. And then it up and dies on me. And you don't realize it. And then one spring you're going, you know what? That plant is gone. Where'd it go? And it just disappeared, died. It happens. You just get another one. It just opens up space in the garden and you get to go buy another plant.
And do you use, do you use chemicals?
I personally do not use chemicals in my garden. I grow a lot of vegetables, and I tell people you can buy pesticide laden vegetables at the grocery store all day long. So why bother in your garden? And there's a couple of ways you can cover certain crops to keep certain, like the little worms that you said were on the broccoli is actually the larva of a white butterfly that you'll see. Oh, it looks so pretty in the garden, and it's laying eggs at the bottom of the base of the broccoli plant, and then the eggs hatch and those little worms come up and they get right in that head of broccoli, and as your dad says, protein. Now you do try to get them all out of there before you actually eat it, and you can cover those crops and things, or sometimes I say I'm just not going to grow broccoli because it's going to have those little worms on it in my garden, or it's going to get eaten up by the worms because I'm just not going to spray anything on it.
One of the things that people often have an issue with is managing animals as well. I live in an area, I live in a city, but it's full of deer. So, everybody, I mean, since COVID, there are a lot of those new, I forget what they're called, but these little boxes that are now on the curbs with, flowers and plants and
Sure.
vegetables and things in them, but they all have these really tall posts with a sort of mesh fence around it to keep the hungry deer out. Do you have any sort of general advice for people who are like thinking of setting up a garden and worried about, what am I going to do about deer or whatever other animals they have in their area?
Well, look around and see if you have neighbors that are gardening, see what they're doing. Because if they're having problems with deer, you will certainly know it. They'll be doing things to try to keep the deer away from their gardens. I personally don't have problems with deer. They say there are deer. There's a woods behind the houses across the street, and they say the deer never leave the tree line, and certainly haven't ever left the tree line, come up through their backyard and across the street to my yard. It's one of those things that you do sometimes end up having to put up ugly fencing and things like that to keep them out. I have rabbits. I have chipmunks, squirrels, raccoons, probably possum. I haven't seen a possum in a while. Groundhog. But I just try to do the least invasive thing to allow them and me to coexist. So I feed birds. I have a big baffle thing on my bird feeder so the raccoons can't get up there and get all the food, because they do every night if you don't do that. And then I employ some rather odd techniques that seem to work for rabbits. And you can look this up on the web because I'm famous for it, is I put little plastic forks up and down the rows where I sow the green beans. And just that little fork sort of keeps the rabbits from the green bean seedlings. I call it the fortress.
That's a really good idea. That's really interesting. And I really like the idea too of accepting that you're going to have to coexist with animals and all these other things that might appear, at least in a kind of immediate sense, to be a problem. I think in particular about the sort of, I don't know, predilection for total control that people who, like, where I grew up, neighborhood where I grew up, there were poison signs on lawns,
right?
Every spring and summer or whatever, because people wanted, didn't want, they couldn't abide nary a dandelion.
Oh, and dandelions. I have the dandelion.
Yeah. And I guess that's a convention that's probably not quite as followed as it was in the past. But, there was people thought that, if I'm going to have this like front yard with grass, it has to be perfect in the sense of totally controlled, or else, I've somehow failed managing my yard or something like that.
Right.
But accepting that, like, some raccoon's going to get in there every once in a while and mess things around, maybe that's why the plant disappeared or something like that. And just accepting that there's going to be these things that you have to constantly be tending to.
Right. And I grow a little bit of sweet corn. I tell people, I know how to tell when sweet corn's ripe. The raccoons get it the night before. They didn't actually this year. I did actually get my own sweet corn, but I mean, there's nothing more maddening than to go out, and it's just like a 4x8 plot of sweet corn. I only expected to get about 6 ears out of it. To go out there and find the whole thing is just trashed because the raccoons have gotten in there and trashed it to get to the sweet corn.
I imagine that people ask you for advice all the time. And I was actually curious to ask you for the last, longer than I wish it had been. I've been asking people a little bit about, like, how has the pandemic affected you and things like that. And did you see an uptick in people following your blog or asking you for advice or things like that as people got into gardening so much in the last year and a half or so?
Well, this is going to come as a big surprise to you, and maybe not, but I don't really track my blog statistics very closely. I do see a few comments. I get some emails from people that will read something like, I grow figs outside in Indiana, which is not the usual thing that people think. And so I get 2 or 3 emails a season that says, hey, tell me about growing figs outside in Indiana. What are you growing? And I'll answer those emails, but I don't really closely track my blog statistics. I write because I enjoy writing and posting, and that's it. I'm good.
Well, and in addition to writing and posting, it turns out you also started podcasting as well, getting information out there to people in a fun and humorous way. When did you get the Garden Angelist blog started?
The Garden Angelist blog, Dee Nash and I started that so we just did our 150th episode. So about 3 years ago, 2018, we started it in the fall of 2018. We were both at a garden communicators convention in Chicago. People were talking about blogging. That's the next big thing. We knew a couple people that were doing garden blogs, and she just texted me one day and she says, let's do a podcast. And I'm like, okay. And that was it. We just started doing this podcast.
Actually, for those listening, sorry.
We've known each other for a long time, obviously, through garden writing, even though she lives in Oklahoma and I live in Indiana.
And for any authors listening who might be a little bit, how do you actually start a podcast? Did you have any resources that you went to or anything like that? Or did you just kind of set things up?
Well, we knew a couple of other garden writers that were doing a podcast, and they were doing, not like the one person doing it, but a combination. And the one woman lived in Cape Cod and the other one in New Mexico. And they did a session at this conference to explain how they did it, how they did their recording. And so we said, okay, we can do it too. And so we figured out where we wanted to host it. I looked at different hosting things. I didn't end up using the hosting company they used. I ended up with a different one, which I've been very happy with. It's sort of I think a newer player in the market, and they've kind of grown and added features every year. So, and then recently we used to get on Skype, and then we would each record on GarageBand, and she would send me the recording. And now we're doing like we're doing here, where we do it on Zoom. And then depending on the quality, I can either get the single recording and say that's good enough, or I get the separate ones and do more editing.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing the details of that. We've been doing this one for about 10 years. And yeah, I've seen things change. And, particularly, with Zoom, it's really changed and it's evolving. It's getting better and better, particularly at voice levels and things like that.
Right.
Canceling out background noise, because in the old days, with the old tools I used to use, there was a Skype call recorder app, and it didn't like kind of turn off the feed when a person wasn't talking automatically. So there was like just a lot more editing that you had to do in those days, and things have gone a lot better. And so just moving on to the next part of the interview. So you have self-published all of your books. I have. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that decision. Did you ever consider approaching a traditional publishing company and asking them for a contract?
I briefly did. I rather informally talked to one publisher, and I said, hey, I want to write a book of gardening essays, and there won't be glossy photographs of gardening in there. It will just be fun little stories about gardening. First thing they said is, oh no, you got to have pictures. And then I told him what I thought about calling it, and he says, oh no, you can't call it that. And then I realized that if you're going to edit with a publisher, it's a partnership, and you're providing just one piece, the writing. They're going to figure out the cover. They're going to figure out the title. They're going to figure out the distribution. So you're not really going to have your baby, so to speak, except in between the two covers. And even then, there's probably going to be an editor who's going to do some massaging. So I knew that what I was writing, the gardening essays, is, for lack of a better way to put it, more personable than many gardening books. And I just decided, I'll do it myself. So that's what I did. Not exactly by myself. I did hire somebody for the first couple of books, a company called The Garden of Words. And so I wrote it, and I told them what I wanted the covers to look like. And they got a graphic designer and showed me the covers, and everything was good. And they packaged it up and they got them uploaded. And then after I saw what they did, I had them work on the first 4. This last one I did myself. I did hire a graphic designer because the cover has a certain look to it. And the children's book I did with basically my nephew, who's a graphic designer. He did all the illustrations, and we did that one together because I guess I have enough awareness of computer technology from working in it all those years. I'm not afraid to go out and just try it. And I look and say, oh, that's easy. Oh, that's not a big deal. So now I think from this point on, I'll probably do most of them myself with my graphic designer doing the covers.
And what sort of tools or apps do you use to produce your books?
So this last book, I actually used a tool called Vellum, which is on the Mac. And Vellum is used by a lot of people that are writing fiction. You basically take your Word document and you download it into Vellum, and then you can format it and add pages and things. I think you can probably add pictures and illustrations if you want, but I use that, and then it uploads the exact formats that you need to upload. And I publish through Ingram Spark, and then I can do a hardback because some people like hardbacks. I can do the paperback, and I also let them do the ebook, although I hear that's not the best deal for ebooks. And then that's what I use. And then independent bookstores will go out to Ingram Spark. They will order books, because if you use Amazon, the KDP, as your only distribution mechanism, there's no independent bookstore that I know of that will go out to Amazon and order books at 40% discount. That's the competition. That's the wolf that's eating their lunch. So, but Amazon got really fussy when I decided that I was going to use Ingram Spark for sole distribution and not upload it to Amazon via KDP. Amazon would not show that book in stock at all. It was always out of stock, the paperback. So to appease Amazon, I do upload a version to KDP that's on Amazon. I turn off worldwide distribution from Amazon or expanded distribution and let Ingram handle that. And that seems to work for me. So then it does show up, and not that I'm getting sales from Target.com and Walmart.com and Barnes and Noble, but it does show up in all the places that get the basic feed from Ingram Spark and show the books, including bookshop.org.
Yeah. Thanks very much for sharing all those details. That's super helpful to anyone, not only anyone who's sort of thinking about getting into self-publishing in the first place, but who's experienced something similar. And it's always helpful to hear about that you're not alone, what precisely happened and why, or at least why, insofar as you can figure it out, and what you can do about it. The Amazon's obviously a huge issue for people in a lot of ways. That is where a lot of eyeballs are, and they know it, and so they can do things to you. They're basically all automated, by the way. So don't think Amazon's coming after you personally, but
no, they are not.
But they, and that automation can itself be of regulating things. You can end up being, it might be misapplied to you, and then you can end up in an awful place where you're trying to get your book visible again, or get your account reinstated, or what have you. I don't know this for certain, but I believe at least it used to be the case that they would automatically check to see if you were selling book elsewhere for less, if you were enrolled in certain programs in Amazon, and then they'd find various ways to try and pressure you to not do that. And so, getting your book on there is kind of like, a lot of people do it, but it does come with a headache factor.
Right. I price my book the same across all the platforms, from using myidentifier.com, which is where you go get your ISBNs, says the retail price, same retail price on Ingram Spark, same retail price on Amazon. So there's, if Amazon knocks it down, and sometimes I've seen like the hardback that I priced at $24.99, I've seen it for $2.99. I think, oh, I should buy a bunch of copies for that price.
Yeah. Actually, that reminds me, you do sell autographed copies as well.
Yes.
What mechanism did you use to set that up, and how does that work?
So today I use Square, and I have an online store, and it works pretty well. I did discover something. Square will only allow me to take credit cards that are in the United States. So somebody from Canada tried to order a book, and they said they won't take my credit card. And so I'm like, that's weird. So I looked it all up, and it said, oh, you can only take US credit cards. So the person was willing to pay me on PayPal, but then I said, well, by the way, you wanted to buy 3 books, and 3 books sent to Canada will cost you $25 in postage alone. And they're like, thanks, goodbye.
Yeah, those kinds of things can be really tricky. But I guess just to sort of tie that off. So the way it would work is someone puts in an order through through Square, and then you get the order, and then you actually put the autographed book into a box yourself and send it yourself.
I put it in an envelope. I take it to the post office. I mail it out media mail, though the price of media mail just went up again. So I got to compare it to first class and make sure I'm not getting snookered by the post office.
Yeah, it's funny. I used to have some acquaintances who sold used books online. They were the kind of people who go to the auctions kind of thing and get the big consignment, or whatever. And they lived in Montreal, and they did all their U.S. business by driving down to the States and sending the mail from there. It was
you would have to. It's just ridiculous to get it across the border, because with my first book, I actually hired a publicist, which I won't do again, because I realized they were sending the book to people that I knew, and it's just like I just had to have the gumption to go ask them, hey, you want a copy of my book? Can I be on your radio show? I don't need to pay this woman to do it. But she convinced me to send the book to Canada. And so that's when I realized how much it costs to send books to Canada. So I sent 2 or 3, and I says, I got to sell several books off these deals in order to make it work.
Speaking of gumption, you just gave me a great segue into the next part of the interview where we talk about your recent blog post, how to market your book without social media, which of course we'll be linking to. But if you're looking for it and you're just listening to this, it's on Jane Friedman's website at janefriedman.com. I really liked this post when I came across it. I particularly like the great advice and the straightforwardness. And, often, I was saying this again before we started recording, but, often when you sort of see things about like how I got off social media or whatever, it's often kind of there's a lot of resentfulness and stuff like that in it and stuff like that. And this post is not like that. This is just like it's just, you can do it if you want to, but if you do, you still have to do a lot of work to market your book.
That's right.
It's not going to happen because you don't like social media and that makes you feel good about yourself somehow by getting off of it, which maybe it should, but you still have a lot of work to do. And one of the things you talk about in there is getting a guest appearance on a podcast.
I got one,
and you got one. Although I reached out to you, you didn't reach out to me, but you do specifically mention, hey, go ask if you find a good podcast, present yourself. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about how you go about doing that, because I know that we do get, well, sometimes from publicists, those are typically the worst. Do you want to have my guest on my client on your podcast? And it's the reason I say that they're worst is typically these are people who just cut and paste and don't tailor the message to the particular podcasting recipient. And whenever you see that, it's just kind of insulting and unprofessional. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, like, for people who are wondering, okay, well, how I'm shy or I'm worried about, pissing someone off, how do I go about asking to be a guest on a podcast?
Well, the first thing is you should know the podcast. And so Dee and I were asked a couple of months ago, this woman said, hey, do you mind if I recommend guests for your podcast? And we're like, have you ever heard our podcast? We have yet to have a guest on there. It's always just the 2 of us. So if you know that they have guests, you just reach out to them. And I mentioned I'm in Garden Communicators International. And so I know people that have podcasts and they do have guests, and I reach out and say, hey, I want to be a guest. Or they have a radio show. So I've got 2 podcast appearances, kind of out there waiting to set a date. I've got 1 radio date. It's not till December, but, she says, we'll sell your book for Christmas, which is perfect. And another one, she says, I'm in my busy season, but we'll have you on this fall. And so sometimes you have to remind them and say, I'm still out here. I'd love to be a guest. And, it's just a matter of just, you want to be asking, but you don't want to be a pest about it.
And as you say, know the podcast and make it clear in your email or your message, however you get it to them, that like you do know their podcast.
Exactly.
And it doesn't have to be like super complicated, and it doesn't necessarily need to be full of compliments or something like that. It's like, hey, I really like your podcast. I particularly enjoyed the recent interview that you did with so and so about such and such. I recently published a book on a similar topic and thought, hey, maybe I'd be a good, like it's common sense once you've thought it through and you know it. But until you've done that, it might seem a little bit like
Right.
tricky. But just be specific about the podcast and be specific about why you think you'd be a good guest and what you think you can talk about. You might end up talking about something completely different, but
Right.
but just showing them that like you're a real person on the other end. You're not somebody who bought, who got a productivity app and dumped a bunch of email addresses in there to try and go get some attention that way. Yeah, don't do that. Most people don't like that.
Well, speaking of email, I did find that when I sent a blind carbon to like 10 people and said, hey, my new book is out. You've taken review copies in the past and helped me promote it. Are you interested? I got about 2 that responded, because I think it was a blind carbon. But when I sent a note to them specifically, and then they were like, oh yeah, I'd love a copy, Carol. And so
yeah, it's funny. I think it's true in all kind of, I don't even want to say industries. It's just, if it looks like it's, blind carbon or a cut and paste, whether it's, for any startup people out there, if you're approaching a venture capitalist for potential investment, definitely make it clear that you know who they are, and the formula. The reason I have the formula in my head is because there was a time in my life when I was doing that. And it's like, I recently read about your investment in such and such and such and such. And, we really think that our company might be a good fit for you, things like that. And there are, people who are in those worlds where they're often being reached out to who are very explicit. Like, I just don't answer something that doesn't look like it's specific to me and it's coming from a real person.
Right. I don't either.
Yeah. You also talk about professional organizations as a way of marketing your book without being on social media. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
So I am in, I know that a lot of writers join American Society of Journalists and Authors. I'm in a group called Garden Communicators International, and we're in the United States, Canada, with people as far away as Australia. But we all have in common that we're writing and articles and books, and we're doing podcasting and radio shows and TV shows. It's all about communicating about gardening. And so I can tell you, as somebody who does a weekly podcast and tries to post on her blog regularly, good quality content is always needed. And so you can reach out to them and, can you do a review of my book? Can you, write about it? Would you like a review copy? And you just sort of get the word out through this professional organization, and they get to know you too, and sort of reciprocal. So like Dee and I in our podcast, every week we talk about a gardening book, and probably 80% of the books that we talk about are review copies we've gotten from the publishers or from the authors themselves that said, could you mention my book? And the nice thing is, for somebody like me that's not on social media, a lot of times if we mention their book, then we'll send back and say, hey, we talked about your book on this week's podcast, and they'll socialize it for you.
One really interesting thing you also mentioned there is that although that it's all about like how getting off social media and what's all the other work you can do, you do have a LinkedIn presence.
I do,
and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that's the sort of exception.
I made LinkedIn the exception because I feel like that's still a place where people go out to find quote unquote professional Carol. So I'd like to find out more about Carol Michael, the author. And so I can put stuff out there, and I try to make the content that I put on LinkedIn relevant to quote unquote professional Carol, the garden writer. And it's not, you don't go out there and see somebody's grandkids, which is fine. I don't want to say that certain posts and stuff are bad, but you tend to see professionalism on LinkedIn more so. At least I do, the way I've linked into people, less so on Facebook.
Yeah, it's interesting what a practical matter it is. So I was really glad when I read that you were on LinkedIn because, I could find your about page on your website and stuff like that. But for people who are thinking of interviewing you, or people who are thinking of doing a write-up about your book or something like that, having something that's a little bit more serious and kind of third party, even though you write all your own content on LinkedIn anyway, but is actually really helpful for people who are doing research on you, which they will do if they're going to be interviewing you or something like that, or doing a review and things like that. So having some kind of presence out there is still important, even if it's not the 240 characters and here's a picture of my cat or something like that kind of
Well,
thing.
the internet was invented to share cat photos. That's known fact.
And by the way, nothing against cat photos. I love cats and cat photos, but if that might, wherever you're doing that might not necessarily be the best place to also be promoting your professional stuff.
Unless you are a professional, like feline expert or something.
Exactly.
A breeder of Siamese cats or something.
You also mentioned local bookstores, and this is a matter of basically walking in and going, "Hey, would you be willing to sell my book?"
Yes, and what I tell people is, you can't walk into a bookstore that you have never been in, you have never shopped in, and you have never bought anything in that's local. That's just, you can't say, "Hey, I buy all my books on Amazon, but why don't you carry my book in your store?" But if you go in there and you're a regular customer and they find out you're an author, they'll carry your book. And so unfortunately, the closest bookstore to me is about 25 miles south as far as independent. I don't count Barnes and Noble's an independent. And there's another one north of me, about 30 minutes. The one north has a mix of used and new, and she takes books on consignment, but I just got a nice check from her from the books she sold. And the one south of me is all new books, and she's always happy to stock them. And so I need to get down there because I think she's got some of my new books. I need to go down and sign them.
Another thing that you mentioned, and there's a specific thing in there, is having a YouTube channel. And the thing that you mentioned in there that I really liked was that you don't have the biggest presence, but you enjoy doing them. And I think this is something that's often, for self-published authors, even people who are newer, people who have been doing it for a while, you often think of the work you do to promote your book as this like chore, this unpleasant thing. It's work. It's like, I've got to figure out how to game the Facebook ads algorithm after I've already figured out how to change the Amazon algorithms. And then they've changed on me already. And, you're always playing catch up and you're being competitive with other people for space and stuff like that. And maybe you should still do those things. But it's also important to keep in mind that you can actually, and this is kind of a general theme of your post, is like, you can actually limit you're self-published. It's up to you what you want to do, right? And
exactly,
you can actually limit your book promotion activities to things you enjoy doing. that's okay.
Exactly. And I'll say, I did talk to somebody, and she's like, "Oh, Carol, I'd like to get off social media like you do, but my book's just coming out, and my publisher would just freak out if they found out, I wasn't going to post on Instagram." And and she has a very lovely book, and it's got a lot of pictures in it, and so it really, can attract a lot of people with good pictures on Instagram, I guess. But she's like, "Oh, I wish I could get off." And she only has 1,400 followers on Instagram. I looked it up the other day. And then I heard this other author talk. He has 600,000 followers on Instagram. And he wrote a book about houseplants. But he wrote a book about houseplants because he had 600,000 followers on Instagram. A literary agent approached him and said, "Hey, I think you could write a book." Well, first of all, if you're writing about gardening, very few of us have literary agents. It's usually the publishers, and most of the publishers just work directly with the authors. So if you have 600,000 followers on Instagram, knock yourself out, have fun, just the right person at the right time with the right subject matter. Houseplants, which are very big with I don't even know what generation it is, but the ones in their 20s and 30s, houseplants is a big deal for them.
I think that's Gen Z.
Yeah, Gen Z, whatever. I'll admit that I'm a baby boomer, and so after that, I lost track of all the different generations. So
yeah, I'm from the generation that was first given a letter, Generation X, and we're the one that no one knows anything about, except that we have to take care of our parents and our kids, kind of thing.
There you go.
And there are more items in your list and things that you talk about in the blog post, but the last one I'd like to ask you about is speaking. So you mentioned that speaking publicly can actually be really a good way of getting attention. And particularly if you're writing, I mean, the thing is, this is true both if you're writing about fiction and if you're writing about nonfiction. I remember the last time I went to Book Expo America in New York a few years ago, some authors, they were fiction authors. They got on a panel and they talked about their books and they talked about their genre and stuff like that. And everybody absolutely loved it. People love seeing authors in person. They love hearing them talk. They love being able to ask them questions and things like that. And so when it comes to speaking, so I imagine it's probably like with podcasts or radio shows, one thing you do is you find the right venue and then you put yourself forward as a potential speaker.
Yes. And so I'm registered on another site called Great Garden Speakers. And so I can be found there. And then, of course, within my local city and everything, people know that I'm a speaker, and so they'll hire me. And it is interesting. I pretty much can judge an audience by looking at them exactly how many books I sell, because older audiences tend to buy fewer books. They're trying to get rid of stuff, not add stuff to their collection. And then some people, they tend to buy the book after they hear you speak, because before you speak, they're like, not quite sure. What are these gardening humor books you have, Carol? And then I speak and I try to make my presentation humorous. And then they're like, oh, humor, I'm going to buy that book. So it just varies. I went to speak in Florida, which was a big deal for me. That's a long way from Indiana. And I told them, I says, I've never gardened in Florida. And they're like, okay, but you're funny. So I shipped 50 books and thought, oh, I hope I don't have to schlep back 45 books. And I ended up selling like 59 because they all wanted the book afterwards. And then, they just kept giving me money, and I took down addresses and then mailed them the books later. So that turned out to be pretty nice. So the bigger the venue, the better. And a lot of master gardener groups and stuff, they'll have a couple hundred people there. And so if you have 200 people there and 20% will buy the book, which is kind of my average, that's 40 books.
That's great. Thanks very much for sharing that. That's really good. It's funny because, you often hear the sort of, stories of like, I went all the way across the country and there were like 3 people in a bookstore basement. But it can actually turn out really well, and you can meet people and you can have a great time, and they can have a great time when you do speaking engagements like that, and you can also sell books. Carol, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to be on the Front Matter podcast. I
appreciate you having me. I will be listening very soon.
Thanks very much. And I'll make sure to, again, to have links to everything, including your latest book in the transcript online.
Thank you, Len.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a Lean Pub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.